Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second this time this year or third time this year, Ask the Experts at the IAD. I'd like to invite our panelists to please join me online with their cameras and sound on, or cameras on, and welcome to everyone. I hope everyone is keeping warm if you're in Joburg, and anywhere else where it's as cold as it is in Joburg, and welcome. We have a great panel today. I'm very excited because we have a huge knowledge base here to discuss the topic that we have tabled. And we look forward to welcoming questions from everyone from the audience, as well as comments and information that you would like to share. During the course of our conversation, you will hear possibly some references to documents and frameworks and bits of information, reports. Please don't fear, we will compile a list of all these documents that we want to share with you, and we will send it in a post event email where we will share all the links to the documents and all the information. We will also possibly post them in the chat as we go, but don't fear, the information will be available to you. So, good afternoon to the 60 participants who have joined us so far, and we'll watch that number grow, I'm sure. And welcome to this Ask the Experts on Climate Change. Climate change is quite a broad description of what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be looking at understanding both climate risk and a duty of care in a changing business landscape, and possibly providing guidance through the documents that I've mentioned now and through our conversation on what questions to ask and what resources are available to assist organizations to develop a strategy to address emerging climate risks and making a just transition. I see everyone's coming in from Mossel Bay and Sandton and Cape Town. Welcome, welcome. Okay, so let's kick off, and I'll introduce you to our esteemed panel. We've got Dr. Jess Schulschenk. She's the director of the Sustainability Institute, as well as partnership directors at the Embedding Project. We've got Brigitte Burnett, head of sustainability at Nedbanks. Dr. Christopher Trissos, Senior Researcher in African Climate and Development Initiative and Director at the Climate Risk Laboratory. He's also the lead author for the African chapter of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. It's abbreviated to the IPCC report. You will hear about it in a short while, so just so that you know that's what it is. And Shameela Soobramoney, the Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSC, and Nicole Martens. Nicole, when she joined our project with us, she was the Senior Associate Consultant at Trialogue, and in the transition of while we advertise in our event, she has changed over to Senior Stewardship Professional at Old Mutual Investment Group. So thank you and welcome. So there's a lot to understand and a lot to get to grips with on this topic. And I'm going to just open the session quickly with a question to Jess, asking with regards to, we hear about a lot of the physical risks of climate change, like impacts on agriculture and the insurance industry. But what are the transition risks and how will they impact different sectors? I'm just jumping right in there with a big question, just to set the scene, and anybody else, we will go on to the next set of questions as soon as we have set the scene. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Julie. I think the first thing that we saw from the report that you mentioned is that there's really varying levels of understanding and awareness when it comes to climate issues and what the impacts will be on the business sector. There's also a lot of new language coming out. So for people from a science background or who've worked in the climate space before, we might be familiar with terms like adaptation and mitigation, and you'll hear them used a lot. But I think it's important to sometimes pause and just take a moment to understand what some of these big issues are and what they will mean from a business perspective. So physical risks, often we hear people saying, well, climate doesn't really affect my industry. I'm not in agriculture. We weren't affected by the flooding or day zero. I don't insure infrastructure and farms. It's not really a big thing. Increasingly, what we're seeing is the impacts are not only in terms of the direct physical risks, and we know the sectors that they impact heavily, but also the increasing expectations and the shifting landscape. And so that can be on a few different fronts, and these are what we're calling transition risks. It can be from a policy perspective or from a legal perspective. So we are aware of the carbon tax, we're aware of shifting expectations around compliance, around reporting, and Shameela can speak more to that as the JSE. So for example, any company listed on the JSE, there will be increasing expectations around climate disclosure and performance. But we also see it in terms of shifting technologies and shifting market expectations. Anybody who's having
Oh, we've lost Jess for a second there, and I'm hoping it's not load shedding. Okay, while we're waiting for Jess to join us, I'm just going to remind our audience that if you have any questions that you would like to pose, to pop them into the Q&A section, and any chats you can keep into the chat group. It looks like we may have lost Jess there. So I think if, well, the moment she comes back, we can go back and revisit that question. But I'm going to jump in and ask Brigitte a question, if that's okay. Brigitte, you, from a Nedbank perspective, I'd like to know, can you outline Nedbank's thought process and considerations when addressing climate change at a board and related governance level? Just taking it back to the board and the directors. Can you share that information, your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Julie. I think a really good question that we've kind of grappled with for quite some time at Nedbank, given our focus on social development, particularly through environmental sustainability, social and economic sustainability. But given the growing impact of climate and the unique position that South Africa finds itself in as a high emitter with low levels of inequality, it was really a conscious focus of our board of directors to raise the relevance of climate as a consideration at a board level, as a separate focus from all of the other considerations that one has as a board, just to heighten not only the focus, but the urgency with which we as a financial intermediary could play a role in a just transition for the country. Climate is such a wide systemic risk that it touches on so many different areas. So we were picking it up in the mandates of various board committees, but really to heighten that focus and to provide strategic steer for the longer term, we felt it really important to set up a board subcommittee focused on both the risk side, but also the business opportunity side and the side of climate resilience to bring forward that journey for the bank. And it's been quite interesting in terms of our own growth and learning and understanding as a collective at board and executive management in that process, but also to sort of see how there is an overlap of mandates then at a board committee, and how do we actually work through that. So it's been an interesting learning process. As a board subcommittee, we put forward very proactive resolutions around climate change, and learning how that then impacts and cascades in the organization has been an interesting journey.
Thanks, Brigitte. I appreciate that. Jess, I think, is just overcoming some load shedding transition issues from one device to another, I'm sure. Jess, you were in midstream and giving us some information. Would you like to continue?
I have no idea where I got cut off. I think I was just talking to myself for a while there. Sorry, backups between load shedding and data and all the rest.
No problem. I think what we can do is just give you a breather to catch up with us. And I'm going to go to Christopher and ask a question. And now, Christopher, as I mentioned before, you're the lead author for the IPCC reports. And I wanted to ask you, what were some of the key insights from the recent IPCC report for Africa? Can you share some of that info?
Sure, and thanks for having me on the panel. I think there are a number. It's the strongest Africa chapter that there's been in terms of integration of data and knowledge across the whole continent. I'd say at the scale of the whole report, before we get to Africa, there's a very strong statement that the scientific evidence is clear that climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and that any delay in concerted global action on preventing climate change and adapting to climate change will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And when we say, well, how brief is that window? It's really talking about climate action this decade. The report that looks at the energy transition says if we haven't peaked emissions by around 2025, but particularly a decrease in emissions of around 40% by the end of this decade, then the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming goal is off the table. It's unachievable this century. And people think, well, 1.5 degrees warming, what does that really mean? Well, some major findings from the Africa chapter are that there has already been substantial damage to economic growth in Africa because of human-induced climate change. The science, we can now attribute that. So on average, GDP per capita is about 13% lower for African countries than it would have been if we had not had additional climate change since 1990. The Cape Town drought, the reduced rainfall that led to that drought was 3 times more likely because of human-induced climate change. About 44% of heat-related mortality in South Africa's, the districts of South Africa, can since 1990s be attributed now to human-induced climate change. There are ecosystem degradation and loss, so mass death of coral reefs in tropical East Africa, but in Southern Africa also the woody thickening of our savannas and grasslands, which degrades grazing lands, it reduces our water security, it also harms ecotourism. People don't like to go and try and see rhinos and lions in thick shrubby environments, they prefer open grasslands. And savanna. So really widespread impacts, reduced food production as well. South Africa, there's been about a 34% reduction in our rate of agricultural productivity growth across the continent. And that's the most negatively affected of any region globally. And again, attributed to human-caused climate change. And so that's just, we're at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming today. And when we talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius, which could happen as early as the 2030s. And so we're going more likely than not, we will get 1.5 degrees Celsius. The question is, will we limit it? Will we stop there or do we keep going? And so at 1.5 degrees Celsius, the types of things we see are widespread crop losses across Africa. In the case of South Africa, we could see a 40% reduction in wheat yields, even with adaptation options being fully implemented. We would see an increase in disease exposure as malaria moved south into parts of Southern Africa and uplands into highland areas of East Africa. We would see increasing poverty and inequality with increased negative impacts on African economies. We would see increasing heat mortality, particularly in parts of West Africa and West African cities, where already at a 1.5 degrees Celsius, you could get 2 weeks long heat waves of over 40 degrees Celsius, where many people are unable to afford the power needed for things like air conditioning and live in exposed informal settlements where in a South African context, it can be 5 degrees Celsius hotter inside a shack with a tin roof on a hot day than outside. And also in the east of South Africa, increased heavy precipitation events where we've had a preview with what happened in Durban twice in the last month. And as we go up to 2 degrees Celsius and higher, these impacts only get more severe, projected impacts. So the response option, the report's clear in the context of Africa that globally, and Africa has to play its part, we really have to have deep greenhouse gas emissions cuts, and these need to be enacted rapidly. But Africa being especially vulnerable, we have to really accelerate our action on adapting to climate change to limit these most severe risks, particularly in health sector, in the food sector, in the biodiversity areas. And the last thing I'd say that's very clear in this most recent report compared to previous ones is because we now need to go so fast, we also, it's dangerous to do that independently in individual sectors. That can lead to maladaptation. And so a good example of that in the African context is you hear a lot about afforestation and tree planting as a climate solution. And that's often not the case. So if you just look from a carbon storage perspective, you might think, okay, this is a good thing, we should plant trees. But when you look at it across sectors, then often the areas in Africa that are being targeted for planting trees are naturally not forested. They're savannas and they're grasslands. And by planting trees there, we are reducing our biodiversity, we're reducing our livelihoods from pastoralism, we're increasing water security risks, we're increasing food security risks. And by transforming those ecosystems under future drought and heat waves, which could lead to wildfires with climate change, we might actually be doing a disservice for the greenhouse gas mitigation part, because you're locking up a whole lot of carbon in trees, but that could catch fire 20 or 30 years from now. And so that final point I'll make is it's crucially important for the private sector, the public sector, people working in the food industry, people working in the extractives industry, people working in the financial industry, to really build coalitions and consult each other as they make these climate risk management decisions, that they don't just go unilaterally. It really requires everyone working together. Thanks.
Jules, you're muted.
Thank you so much. You'd think by now I'd know when I'm muted and when I'm not. As I was saying, that's quite some sobering content there for us to digest. And one would think then when we organizations will build their approach or their strategy towards climate change into their own business strategy. And I want to just go to Nicole and ask Nicole, Nicole, what when it comes to integrating climate change considerations into business strategies, where should directors start?
Thanks very much, Julian. I think thanks to Christopher for just breaking it down there for us as well. I know that Jess will also have a lot to add on the science of it. I think the very first thing for boards and directors to take into account is really to echo Brigitte's point around what their approach was at Nedbank, is to be proactive. So waiting around for all the data to be perfect, or the science to be perfect, or the technology to be perfect, or for a policymaker or a regulator to give you the guidance you need to get going is really not helping anyone. So very much the first thing you need to do is be proactive. And that can start with capacitating your board, making sure that your board they don't have to be climate experts, right? I think that's one of the big misconceptions, is that the only way for you to be able to address these issues is to be some sort of specialist in it. You just need to know which questions to ask. And the guide that IWSB and Sustainability Institution and Trialogue produces one way to get started on that. I think once you've made that decision to capacitate yourself and to get going, the next thing is really to understand your baseline. So where are you starting? So really going through an exercise of understanding what are the climate-related risks and opportunities that directly impact our business, and how does our business directly impact and indirectly impact the climate change related risks and opportunities that are facing the economy or the market as a whole. So establishing your baseline. The next thing is really about disclosing this and communicating where you are in the process. So I think, something like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I'm sure some of the people in the audience will be familiar with. And if you aren't, please do have a look. We'll send some resources. I'm sure there's also resources in the guide to help you understand this. This is a framework that's been developed by a global regulatory body to give you a good starting point on developing your business strategy, focused on forward-looking actions, right? So understanding going forward, what are the climate risks and opportunities that we're facing as a business? What is within our realm of influence? And how do we go about getting to the position we need to be in the time that we have to get there? So a framework like that is great because it helps you to understand around your governance, your strategy, around targets and measurement, exactly what it is that you need to be thinking about. And I think it's really important for businesses to understand, and leadership to understand, when you're starting on this journey, that it is a journey. And I know it's cliched and we hear this term all the time when it comes to this space, but it's not something that you can put on the agenda for one AGM and then it's done. It's really an ongoing exercise in commitment and education and continuous adaptation as you go. The data is constantly improving. What we consider best practice today could quite literally be outdated tomorrow. So it's really about making sure that you've got a good idea of where you're starting, where you need to get to, and that you're being very clear in your communication of your progress on that journey. I think when it comes to where do you start, that's really it. It's getting a framework like the TCFD, or even starting with something like the King Code that provides the guidance now on sustainability, accepting that this is part of your role as business leadership. So it's not something that is an add-on or a nice to have or something that you should defer to the sustainability team in your organization. It's really part of your core responsibility as the directors of a company. And so it's in your best interest and it's your obligation to understand these issues, educate yourself, and get going on that. And I think as you go, communicating the whole time is really important. And back to Christopher's point, I think one of the things you need to accept at the outset is that this is an exercise in collaboration. There's this issue, when we talk about climate change, it's such a massive issue, and Jess has done some great presentations before on sort of all the interrelated relationships and the complexity of various environmental, social, and governance issues. There is no way that one company or even one stakeholder group, so when we talk about business as a group or government or public sector, can solve this on their own. The only way that we address this is in collaboration. So I think to answer the question in a very long-winded way, apologies, where do you get started? It's be proactive, take that first step, capacitate yourself, and then communicate and collaborate as you go.
Thanks, Nicole. Shameela, this Nicole was referring to disclosing within your organization, and I would like to just bring that back to you, because the JSC has just recently released for public comment guidance on sustainability and climate disclosure guidance. I know there isn't a final product yet, but can you explain the context for the JSC's sustainability and climate change guidance?
Certainly, Julie. Thanks for having me. Lovely to be here. Please forgive the voice. Very bad flu for 2 weeks. The context for the guidance really is coming from two areas. And the first one is that we're certainly seeing the impact already in the market of what's happening and the risks that the market is starting to face in relation to the climate change risks. The second one is that for a while now, I would say probably around 2 years, we've seen an increased in incidents of companies actually approaching us and say, can you assist us? What is sustainability? What is climate change? Why does this matter to us? And so we've had numerous requests to go, for example, speak to board subcommittees, assist sustainability teams and the like. And so we realized that there was this need that was growing. The pressures were varied. They were coming in some instances from investors, where for the first time a board or at an AGM, for example, a company might have been asked something in relation to sustainability broadly or climate change specifically. And so, often in many cases, that was the first time that the management team or, the board actually took notice of an issue like that. So a little bit reactive in some instances. And in other instances where we're getting companies saying, we're seeing this coming down the line, we're seeing an increasing pressure. And, it might be even driven by a social context. So that was really the background for which was really the push for us to create the guidance. It wasn't the easiest environment in which to create that, right? Because we're seeing a huge amount of change broadly in relation to frameworks, guidance, standards, convergence, and that's area. And then again, on top of that, while we're seeing a bit of convergence, is also fragmentation in relation to jurisdictional approaches, for example, that we're seeing. So it wasn't an easy space to navigate. And the question that you asked multiple times is, should we even start? But given the fact that our companies were having this pressure, I think we felt that it would be probably irresponsible not to at least help. And so how we helped, of course, was the next question. So it was really with the intent to say, how do we help our issues in our market make sense of this environment, of the plethora of reporting standards and frameworks, which in some instances are not helpful because there's so many that they sometimes end up with companies putting up their hands in despair and saying, we actually don't know where to start. But to Nicole's point, we don't have the luxury of not starting at this point in time. And we should have started probably 15 years ago with a lot of serious intent about having to actually deal with the risks that climate change poses. So that's kind of the angle that we came in at. So what can we do to help? So we went through an initial process of just testing the market first to ask, should we even be doing this? We think it's a good idea. We're getting a lot of this pressure. We're seeing this coming from issuers. But should we be doing anything? And the overwhelming response from our issuers was yes. And we saw that across the spectrum, from our smallest companies up to our largest companies, very interestingly. So at least that gave us a basis to say, okay, there is a need to do something. And then what do we want to do? And so that was really helping companies to understand how the different frameworks stack together, create a bit of direction as to where it seems to be going, but most importantly, to help them to lay the foundation for whatever is likely to come. So whether that push is in a later form, a mandatory disclosure requirement, for example, or whether that is really the push from investors right now in the absence of a local mandatory disclosure requirement that is coming from them anyway, because those investors are from different markets. South Africa, in terms of the JSE companies, for example, is a globally exposed market. At last count, we kind of counted that about 70% of our FDI, I think non-infrastructure FDI, was coming from the European Union. Now, if you take that as a pressure just on its own, and you consider that that's a jurisdiction that is running ahead with coming up with disclosure guidelines and for starting to mandate certain things, them in the UK, then you're immediately starting to see that the market is feeling the pressure long before any kind of mandatory guideline, for example, or mandatory requirement might come out. And so the actual economic imperative is there. There's going to be consequences financially. There are already industries that we know from scenario analysis and the like are likely to face stranded assets and like. So there's a serious risk imperative. There's a financial imperative there, but of course the flip side is the opportunity. So we have an opportunity to influence change, to create this future that we know we need to actually create. If we could listen to Christopher, we should have started a long time ago, you know. And so what do we do, and how do we really try to create an enabling environment for both disclosure practices to grow, but also for the actual business model understanding? And yes, we really, really fantastic as a country in that we have the advanced King codes that have helped, that have actually talked about people, planet, profit going back many years already. But, you know, the necessity to actually just help companies navigate from a disclosure perspective, and hopefully that actually supports better practice and behavior, is what we were trying to do. So what we're trying to do is just help them with that. And also, because it's a space that many people kind of go in and kind of like deer in the headlights, how do we help them start? And so the disclosure guidance has narrative disclosures and also a first take at basic metrics that companies could look at. And we have an overarching sustainability disclosure guidance, which is the broad kind of an umbrella. And then the double click on the issue of climate change, which goes into a lot more detail and has been mentioned before, has taken its lead from the TCFD framework, which is now considered effectively, you know, the default kind of reporting or disclosure framework for climate change related issues. And so it's built on that, and it's also built on work that we did as part of the Sustainable Stock Exchanges initiative that we led last year, where we put up a guide for exchanges to actually help their markets with disclosure. And how do they do that? And then contextualize that for local context. So we brought in some of the most recent findings, the pressures that are more localized, and hopefully helping our issuers to understand. So what we really wanted to do is help create that context, give them a set of things that they can start looking at and at least start applying their mind to. And it didn't matter whether we are a sustainability expert or you're the second year student or you're the CFO. Hopefully it's a place you can start to get an understanding and to know what you need to start looking at the very least.
Thanks, Shameela. Just jumping in from a question from our audience, is the JSE's your disclosure guideline aligned to the IWSB exposure draft on the same subject?
Yes, so that's obviously a question that, you know, is on everybody's minds right now, given the influence of the IWSB's exposure drafts that were issued at the end of March. So we explicitly built in time in our timeline, right, for the production of the guidance to be able to wait for that exposure draft to come out and to consider what it said. So in the first draft that we issued, which was in December last year, we aligned with the prototype that was put out by the IWSB at COP26 last year. And we put in a table, for example, at the as an annex in the guidance that made it very clear how the JSE guidance stacks up against the IWSB exposure draft and the EU directives, you know, the EU work that's been done on corporate disclosures. And so you could see kind of the three at that point more leading ones and how they look together, and what we've done as the JSE, and, you know, what one has and what one the other one doesn't have. And we used it on a few dimensions like materiality, target audience, and things like that. So what we have tried to do is to make sure that it's clear how these things stack together. From an alignment perspective, I think alignment is a relative question. So what we've made sure we've done is looked at the best kind of features of the IWSB exposure draft and brought that into the guidance. So this version of the guidance that is due to be released soon will make sure that it is aligned there and that it makes clear how the different things stack together. We're fully cognizant of the fact that it is not the final version of the IWSB, it's the exposure drafts. And so we've made provision to say this is kind of the direction that it's going in, and the way in which we're going to structure the guidance should be in such a way that if you follow the guidance, regardless of where that goes, barring a few technicalities, you should at least, the guidance will help you set the foundation for what's coming. So you're not waiting till for that necessarily, and even for when that becomes mandatory, could be a long time still in our country, for example. But how do we set the baseline to drive practice and behavior in the meantime? So we've made sure we're doing that. Again, we would have expanded on the comparison table that we would put together at the end of the guidance to ensure that those differences are clear, where international is going, things like double materiality, single materiality, target audience, and all of that. We've tried to make clear where those main frameworks sit on those things. And of course, ultimately, it is about an issuer understanding who their target is, who they're communicating with, what is material to them. And that's kind of made clear as to then how that fits in with the various frameworks.
Thanks, Shameela. Appreciate that. We had a question pop up from Sandile, and he asks, it was in relation to Christopher's information. Have we gone past the point of no return, or with collective commitment, is the situation reversible? Chris, do you want to tackle that question, or do you want to just? You have replied to Sandile in the Q&A, but I wanted just to share with the rest of the audience what your thoughts are on that question.
Sure. That's a question we get quite a lot. I'd say the first answer is no, we haven't passed the point of no return, but also the situation is not reversible. We are in already a changed climate, and things will continue to get worse in the very near term, at least regarding global warming continuing and climate hazards intensifying in their frequency, in their severity. So we are locked into that, but we have a huge choice facing us as society, as the public sector, as the private sector, and that's, are we going to let things keep getting worse to the point where many places might become unlivable, or will we stabilize the situation? And right now, there is still a narrow window of opportunity to stabilize around 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if we miss 1.5, we shouldn't throw our hands up and say, oh, we're committed to the apocalypse. Like 1.6, 1.7, every fraction of a degree of warming that we avoid will save lives, will help economies, will help food security, will help human health, will help biodiversity. So we should really be fighting for every fraction of a degree that we can limit global warming. For example, if we were to see 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, South Africa is one of the places on the planet that's warming the fastest. 3 degrees Celsius of global warming could mean something like 6 degrees Celsius of warming in South Africa, double the global average. And so, no, we can't return to what the climate was in the 1850s or even the 1950s. But yes, we have an opportunity to stabilize the situation. And by stabilizing at the lowest possible temperature, which right now what's on the table, still for a brief moment of time, we still can act to stabilize at 1.5. We can do this if we act now, particularly in an African context, accelerating our actions to adapt to the risks and also preventing more climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If we let it run away to the middle of the century, we don't act in the next 10 or 20 years, then we start to face more significant risks around, will we cross tipping points where large-scale ice sheet melting will become a runaway process that raises sea level rise by multiple meters. Those are still tail-end risks that we can't write them off, but from the best available science right now, if we act rapidly, we can still stabilize the situation.
Thanks, Chris. I've got more questions I would like to pose to the panel, but I can see there's a few questions coming through on the Q&A from our audience. I also want to remind the audience that you can also share your questions and comments by speaking. You can unmute yourself or put your hand up and I can unmute you, and then you can ask the questions live if you would like, but I'm also taking written questions. We have an audience member who's asked if we can elaborate on climate change reporting in relation to ESG in annual integrated reports, annual financial statements, sustainability reports, etc., and the responsibility of boards in regards to these reports. Does any particular panelist want to take a stab at that? Jess.
Thanks, Julie. I'm happy to jump in and invite the rest of the panel maybe to contribute as well. Absolutely, there is expectation and this should be required at a board level for appropriate disclosure. And there's a lot of guidance out there in terms of how to understand your scope 1 to extended emissions. It's important to have a look at something called science-based targets, which help you with guidance in terms of what is required to meet the scale of the challenge. And so it's no longer, we've far past the point where it's about saying, well, we can reduce our carbon footprint by 5%. We know that that is not sufficient. And so science-based targets are a good guide in this space. And increasingly, we're seeing commitments that go beyond, that are really adopting a precautionary principle. So for example, the climate pledge is a growing number of companies that are committing to being carbon neutral by 2040. What's really important, and I want to emphasize this in the difference and the importance for boards to also ask, one is disclosure. Are we appropriately understanding, tracking, and transparently reporting on our carbon impacts? But the other is performance. And so often we confuse the two. We think if we simply are disclosing our carbon impacts, our carbon risks, and our carbon kind of investments, that we've done our job. And unfortunately, we require more. So we'll add into the chat and also in the report that's been mentioned, we've included 10 questions that every board should be asking as it relates to climate risk. And the performance question is, have we committed to a credible goal? And are we setting interim targets? 2040 is far enough away that some of us might think we can wait until 2038 to get our acts into gear. But as Christopher has explained, the nature of the unfolding challenge requires quite immediate and swift action. So we need to think, we need to apply our minds, we need to come up with credible plans, and we need to commit to carbon neutrality, but we also need to backcast and set interim targets that create a roadmap of how a company will get there. And then importantly, and we're not seeing enough disclosure around this, is what are the capital allocations that companies are putting in place to resource that transition. So it's one thing to commit. And I sometimes think of this a bit like a New Year's resolution. It's like waking up on the 1st of Jan and saying, this year I commit to running a marathon. That's going to happen, mid-June. It's another thing to wake up and start jogging. And so we actually want to see the commitments in terms of resources, capital, time, expertise to enabling that commitment to become reality. So we're quite passionate about this, but I think disclosure is an important piece of the puzzle and we need to be doing it. And there's a lot of great guidance out there, but it's by no means sufficient. It's not the end of the journey. The journey then needs to translate into action, performance. And I don't know if others maybe want to add to that, because I know there's some great guidance on how that might unfold.
I see a lot of head nodding. Anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah, just a point. I mean, and I couldn't agree with you more, Jess. And I just think on the question of reporting is important, but you need to have something to report. So if you're not doing anything, then there's nothing to report on. So as the board, as the leadership of a company, you need to make sure there is something to report. So don't ask yourself, about all the different reports I have to submit. Ask yourself, what are we doing that is worth reporting, so that we've actually got something to say.
And Julie, just to add on that, the big concerns in terms of one of the trends we're seeing now is the issue of greenwashing. And so how does one mitigate that? Because, we've gotten to a point, for example, we make public commitments, but if the substance is not there to support that, then that becomes an issue very quickly. And we're starting to see, I think quite a quick awakening by people saying we want to scratch under the paint a little bit, we want to kick the tires, look under the hood to see what are you actually doing? And that is going to substantiate those claims. So the trend of this kind of awareness of greenwashing is something one needs to be very careful of. But also now increasingly when we're starting to see, for example, litigation in this space and the increase in litigation globally related to climate change issues becomes a serious issue for boards, right? and for directors and to start thinking about that. So I think these are things we need to be very cognizant of, that you don't take it lightly. It's not about getting the report writer to write the nice glossy to be able to make you look good, but the greenwashing concerns are becoming a reality and is now translating to serious risk. And just only one evidence point of that is the increase that we're seeing in litigation on climate change, for example, globally.
Thanks, Shameela. Brigitte, I think you wanted to add something there.
Yes, thanks, Julie. I think just from a sort of practical experience point of view, the disclosure requirements were really a good sort of starting point to inform our board what could be the expectations of the end of our journey over a year of trying to really grapple with how do we manage our impacts from a climate perspective, and how do we help our clients in a climate journey. So the disclosure requirements are a good sort of input into how do you develop your strategy and how do you tweak your business model to be able to report what you've done through those different disclosure expectations. But to the point of collaboration that Christopher mentioned, we also, in terms of learning as a board and as a collective executive and management team, also brought in sort of investor perspectives, stakeholder activist perspectives to understand really what are the expectations and the needs, and how do we then strategically tilt to be able to meet those. So I think there is definitely an element of referencing disclosures. There's a need for proactivity, there is a need for collaboration. And as Nicole mentioned, we might not all be climate change experts that are serving on boards, but as we deepen our own understanding and be willing to do that, whether it be through ongoing training or events such as this, I think it will really help speed up what we can do over and above just responding to disclosure requirements. So it really is about impactful change. And I think there's always a place for a TCFD, a TNFD to inform us of that, but it really is to bring the focus back to what one can do from an impact action perspective.
Thanks, Brigitte. Chris, a question to you I'd like to pose to you from one of our audience members. What is the trend on the insurance and risk cover? Whoops, that's just, yeah. What is the trend on the insurance and risk cover related to climate change impact on companies and business? Would you like to share some of your thoughts on that? And before you start talking, okay, perfect. You're
sure.
Off mute.
So I'd say from the IPCC assessment, we did a really in-depth assessment of this, working with people who've worked with the insurance industry, and it's not just business, but African countries, companies, and communities are way inadequately insured against climate risk. So Africa is underinsured in general, but especially in regard to climate risk, it's massively underinsured, and that includes African corporations. But there are innovative index-based insurance schemes that can help transfer risk and aid recovery. And what an index-based insurance scheme is in the climate context is, for example, we have long-term climate records. And so we know in current contexts that some threshold of a drought or a climate hazard tends to trigger particular types of losses and damages. And so these index-based insurance schemes are ones that you agree between the insurer and the client. You agree on a threshold for a particular hazard, an index for a particular hazard. And when that is crossed, it allows more rapid disbursement of insurance funds. So you don't have to go through the lengthy process of putting in a claim, and then it takes months for someone to assess that. And then the aid often only reaches vulnerable people on the ground months later, by which time they might be in an even worse situation. So these index-based approaches that allow for more rapid disbursement, I think, are a really hopeful indication of how we might improve risk transfer. That said, a lot of them to date have been sort of pilot project level, only in a few countries, and they're focused mostly on drought and the food production sector. And there's huge scope to expand these into flooding, heavy precipitation. We know that has already increased because of climate change and will continue to do so, and potentially around tropical storms. Tropical storms are a little more difficult, the ones that we see hitting Mozambique, for example, because risk spreading across Africa. It's quite concentrated in the southeast part of Africa, so risk spreading there is more difficult. That said, unfortunately, with further climate change, we could see tropical cyclones hitting as far south as Richards Bay in South Africa and as far north as Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So disrupting major ports on the east coast of Africa, like a direct tropical cyclone hit on Maputo, which is not something we've seen typically, is within the realm of possibility with increased global warming. So really important for the insurance sector and the clients to collaborate more on increasing these products.
Thanks, Chris. Nicole, is there anything else you want to add on that? I think it was related to one of the questions that came up with about climate change for pension funds in respect of their investment strategies and how pension funds can address climate change proactively. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
Sure, and I'm so glad that somebody asked that question, because the role of institutional investors is so important. You really can't understate it. I mean, everything we've been talking about here, when we talk about adaptation, we talk about mitigation and changing, transitioning entire economies, the global economy, none of that happens without money. And the largest sources of that money, other than governments themselves, is going to be institutional investors like pension funds. So I think I'll break it into two things. So when you ask sort of what is the role of the pension funds here, there's two things. The first is around your fiduciary duty, and the second is around your impact mandate. So let's talk about the first one, right? Your fiduciary duty, first and foremost, as a pension fund, as an institutional investor, your job is to deliver returns for your members, right? Is to make sure you take those savings that they've worked so hard for so long, and you invest them in such a way that those people can eventually retire in a way that they have a good standard of living financially. That's your responsibility. What we know is that the evidence we have shows us that companies that more effectively integrate environmental, social, and governance issues, so things like climate change, into their strategies, those companies outperform financially companies who don't look at those things. So that's the first thing. So as an investor, it's 100% your duty to be focusing on those kinds of companies, to be investing in companies that do take this seriously. When you think about climate change more broadly, you should be investing in a way that helps those companies that aren't perfect now, because not everyone's perfect, to transition in a sustainable way. So as an institutional investor, you have that leverage, you have that financial capital that you can use to change behaviors of companies, right? So that's the first thing, is that is your role. Increasingly, though, there's a lot of pressure on institutional investors to invest in a way beyond just what's going to maximize return, but also in a way that is going to increase environmental and socioeconomic stability in a market, right? So you've probably heard the argument that there are no returns on a dead planet. Similarly, there's no returns to be gained in markets that have collapsed into chaos because of poorly managed social or economic issues, right? So as institutional investors, because we've got a long-term horizon, investment horizon of 20 or 30 years usually, we're in a unique position to invest in things that create stability, to create that enabling environment. So looking at long-term investments in things like infrastructure, for example, that are going to create opportunity. And in that way, as a pension fund, as an institutional investor, your mandate becomes dual almost, right? So one is to make sure that your members are retiring in a financially sustainable way, but also that they are not retiring into a wasteland if you can help it. Right. And that's something that the Financial Services Conduct Authority, the regulator for the pension fund industry here, has said more than once. Right. And that's why you're required as a pension fund to start reporting now on your sustainability of your investments. So as a pension fund, if you're here and you represent one, if you're on one of those boards, please start talking to your service providers about their approach on this. What is their strategy? Have they done the baseline? What are the biggest climate-related risks in your portfolio, and what's their plan to mitigate those going forward? Because the role of this institutional investment is so critical. So thank you so much for asking that question. I really appreciate the opportunity to answer, and I hope that that was helpful.
Thanks, Nicole. You'll see within the chat, some of our panelists are posting some great information. If you aren't able to get it down, don't worry, we will capture it in the chat and send it in the post-event email to everyone, as well as any other resources that are mentioned. I'm going to quickly circle back now to Jess and ask Jess a question. There's a lot of talk about becoming net zero. What does this actually mean? And when does it need to happen by? When does it need to happen? What will this take? What will it take for us to get there?
Thanks, Julie. I mean, I think we've spoken to that in part. Originally, the commitments were around being net zero by 2050. Increasingly, we're seeing expectations of that around 2040. Chris spoke to it in some of the chats and the comments that he's been adding, the need to reduce by 40% at least by 2030. I mean, that's really just around the corner. So it's going to require significant shifts in the way in which we engage with energy. But really agriculture as well is a large emitter of greenhouse gases. So it's not limited to the energy and the transport sectors or the ways in which we use energy and move things around. What's also important, and I think is, and I'll get a little bit into how companies start to think about that, perhaps something Brigitte could share with us from Nedbanks' experience, because they've really put a lot of time and effort into mapping that pathway for Nedbank. What it's going to require is for us to firstly think in systems. And so while becoming net zero is an aspect of it, we need to think about ecological health as a whole. So stabilizing the climate is about reducing our contribution to this unfolding disaster. We need to reduce our greenhouse gases, but we also need to invest into our ecological infrastructure. And so increasingly, we're looking at the links between climate and biodiversity around ecosystem health. If we look at what happened recently in KZN with the floods, they were exacerbated because we have lost a lot of the wetlands and protection areas that actually help with flood control and retention. So those can have devastating impacts on lives, on communities, on the economy as a whole. And so the path is towards net zero, but it's not a singular path, and it's not about just achieving one thing. In so the South African context, we concomitantly need to think deeply about social justice and inclusion. So we need to think about a just transition towards a low carbon economy that does not lose jobs, but grows jobs. There are concerns about job loss, for example, in moving away from coal, but there are many jobs to be created in restoring ecological infrastructure. So we need to stop thinking about this as just an energy problem or as just kind of the impacts of extreme weather events. We really need to think about systems health. And I think that then speaks to the earlier points around collaboration. These are by definition wicked problems. They were not created by one person or group of people by themselves. We're all affected by it, and they will not be solved by one individual or group alone. So I'm actually going to pass across to Brigitte, because I think she has really fantastic insight from a practical perspective of what it means to commit to a climate resilient future, incorporating aspects and considerations around climate justice. And the one big thing maybe I can prompt you on, Brigitte, there is what it also means to say no. So yes, we're saying yes to this transition, but it may mean leaving investments on the table. Shameela talked about it, when we have stranded assets. And so it's complicated, perhaps in aspects it's complex, but I think Nedbank's a great example to look towards for some really clear commitments and actions in the space.
Thanks, Jess. Definitely complex and definitely an area that requires that systemic thinking or systems thinking, which is something our board really try to apply from the establishment of the Climate Resilience Committee, recognizing that this is not only a just energy transition, but a just transition of the economy as a whole to a net zero space by 2050. So there was a lot of consideration also in terms of the social justice or climate justice in our decisions. From a pure energy perspective, we took obviously our guidance from the Paris agreements and unpacked what that would mean in terms of a transition from fossil fuels to renewables, and worked back from a 2050 end state to what that would mean in terms of exiting those different sectors, thermal coal, oil and gas, and try to work back from that end state to understand how quickly as an organization we would need to tilt out of that, but at the same time very conscious of the social impacts of that. And maybe to put it in a little bit of an analogy, we sort of realized that South Africa particularly is in a unique position, as Christopher said, where we have very high levels of emissions, maybe equivalent to an Australia, and we have high levels of poverty, maybe equivalent to a Mozambique, and we actually have to address both those dynamics. So we sort of put ourselves in the position of a country called Mozambique and said, how do we actually address the social impacts that poverty and inequality presents in our context, while at the same time reducing emissions? So it took a lot of engagement with business to understand pragmatically how quickly could we do an orderly exit from fossil fuels? How do we work with our clients in that transition themselves? How do we contribute to the skills transfer or development of new skills in the same space? How do we align our foundational spend to that? How do we partner with different people to make this possible? And it was sort of a collaborative learning space at a board and an executive level to understand what could this look like for Nedbank, that we are mindful of the social impacts of our decisions to exit the energy sector. And at the same time, it's not only about energy. How do we think about the impacts from an agriculture sector, from a mobility sector, and how do we continue to balance the needs of an Mozambique in those sectors as well? I hope that kind of illustrates how we went about it. So I think there's relevance to look at elements such as the Paris Agreement, but to be context-based in your strategy thinking and cognizant of the shifting context as well was very important part of our consideration in developing our energy policy and in our glide paths to tilt our business.
Thanks, Brigitte. Appreciate that. This is not something I've done before, but I actually want to invite one of our audience members to see if they want to speak, because they have put their hand up to speak, and I can see they're burning to say something. Gordon Lane, would you like to come on and have a chat with us? You have posed a question, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask it. I don't want to put you on the spot if you'd prefer me to just read it out, but I could see that you did put your hand up once or twice and were quite keen. Gordon? Okay, I think he might let me read it out, because I haven't seen his hand up again. Do the NDCs, and particularly Mzansi, now for someone like me, I'm not 100% sure what an NDC is, so possibly the person who answers it can explain. Do the NDCs...
Gordon's hand is back up, so if you can unmute him.
Perfect, thank you. Let me reach him quickly and allow to talk. Okay, go ahead, Gordon. Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much, Julie. Hi, Jess. Hi, Christopher. Hi, Nicole. And hi, Shameela. Brigitte, I haven't met. So yeah, really, for me, the one question that we've got is we're saying we've got this very narrow window, and we've got the NDCs out there. And I know there was a significant push with the PCC, the Presidential Climate Commission. And Julie, the NDC is the nationally determined contribution of a country that a country commits to in terms of reducing its GHG emissions. But to me, we seem almost to be locking ourselves into a no-win situation with the NDCs as they're currently put. That's really the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, how from a South African perspective could we improve our NDCs? We're focusing quite strongly on technological solutions, whereas there are many other solutions. And the one I think particularly of, and Jess, I think you'll understand this one, is talking to changing the way we operate and do business. I mean, COVID showed us there was a significant opportunity to change travel patterns, living patterns, and that sort of thing. And if we're talking to the just transition, with a population of 40 to 50% unemployed, just focusing on the transition-affected sectors means that we're leaving, another massive portion of the population behind in the just transition. So I think we do need to be broadening that conversation. And I'm wondering how corporates can come into that. And, government is lagging behind. I mean, the climate change bill is probably 5 years too late, and they haven't set any targets, and they won't set any targets for at least 3 years. So there's no point in even looking at that from where we are at the moment. bunch of questions in one almost statement. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Gordon. No problem. I don't know if you want to stay on the line while we answer, or you can just raise your hand again if you want to come back on. Who wants to take a stab at answering this? Okay. I'm going to, Christopher, yes.
I could answer some of, not all, but I think from what Gordon's saying, it's clear that I agree. And the IPCC, the science is clear as well. This is not just about technology transition to energy. So the IPCC report on greenhouse gas reduction highlights what they call socio-cultural factors as a major important opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something that can often be quite uncomfortable for the private sector to talk about, because it requires large-scale transformations of the way we run society and do economies. And so something the IPCC is clear about is it's an incremental change is not enough. And we need these large-scale transformations, and things like dietary shifts, shifting to a more balanced, sustainable diet, which in the case of many South Africans is the case, or low-income South Africans, but as high-income South Africans, we overconsume massively compared to the global average. So more healthy, what's called healthy mobility, things like cycling, rapid public transport, dietary shifts that include particularly less beef or less water-intensive production, avoidance of food waste, reduction of overconsumption in aspects like larger vehicles that have become heavier. So while vehicles have become more fuel efficient, they've also become heavier in recent decades, negating that fuel efficiency. And so we see a lot of rebound effects where we get things like LED lights that are more efficient than incandescent bulbs, but then people put more LED lights in their house, right? Or you get a more energy efficient fridge and then you get a bigger fridge. So it doesn't actually reduce overall consumption. And so these socio-cultural factors that would reduce energy consumption and at the same time, in many cases, lead to healthier environments and healthier people, because we're eating healthier diets, we're exercising more, we're spending more time with family, we're spending more time outdoors, we're spending more time in healthier environments. They have an opportunity to contribute a massive proportion of the greenhouse gas emission reductions necessary to get us to limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And I'd say the responsibility in the private sector context is a lot of these things are often sometimes pushed back against by the private sector because they threaten certain business models, or they're not seen as climate change priorities. You know, it's about individuals, you should make a good choice. But it's equally on business to frame those choices, right? It's not just led by individual consumer choice. There's huge marketing departments and ways that we frame and market to people about what being a consumer consists of in society. And so similarly, there are other changes that can be made in energy efficiency in buildings, things in electrification. Generally, South Africa is quite advanced on that compared to somewhere like the United States, where we use electricity for cooking and warming our homes and more than we use natural gas, for example. But the opportunity there for South Africa is to keep that electrification and to then get that from renewable sources. So I would agree with Gordon in the sense that it's not just about shifting technologies, it's also about socio-cultural and whole economy transformation to really prioritize getting to limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And the last thing I'd add there is that requires enormous investment from the private sector. So one thing we've seen in the IPCC reports, where we put a lot of effort into tracking adaptation finance, is that in the African context right now, South Africa, this is the case as well, is that the amount of money going into adaptation, we have high confidence that it's less than even the lowest estimates of what is needed. And the money that's coming in is overwhelmingly, like over 90% from the public sector. And this is a real challenge in an African context, because a lot of investors look at adaptation in low-income communities and they don't see an obvious way in which they can get a return. But those communities are the ones that are most at risk. And in many cases, most potentially in the future, cripple an economy through things like civil unrest as the results of climate shocks. And so it's unsustainable in the current context to only have public sector finance going into adapting to climate change risks. So we definitely need new innovative finance models and measures that enable increased investment from the private sector into adapting to climate change. It cannot just be a public sector burden to protect people from climate risks while the private sector does the energy industry part. The private sector has to get involved in transitioning economies and societies in addition to just focusing on the energy sector. Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher. Gordon, does that answer your question? Oh, Jess wants to jump in too and give you some more information.
Well, maybe just to say I've added some, kind of 5 key questions to consider in the chat. And the responsibility of boards is not necessarily to answer all these questions, but the important role that a board plays is to ask them. So if you do want to scroll up a bit in the chat, you'll see 5 key questions. One of them relates to, I think, what Chris has just spoken to now as well, which is, do we understand what it will mean to do our part to positively contribute to society and protect the planet? And that may mean questioning fundamentally some of the current business models, the ways of working, marketing strategies. I mean, these are hard questions to ask, but they're really important. And I think to Nicole's earlier point, they're ongoing. So I would really encourage you, if you are a member of a board, if you play a role as a director, to consider those questions. You don't have to have all the answers, but the conversations need to be had. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Jess. Shameela, would you like to add anything here as the JSE represents a large group of private companies? Anything else you would like to add on this?
So, Julie, a lot of it has been said already, and I think Christopher set out that context so clearly for us. The only additional thing I think is intent. So I think when it comes to how companies are going to contribute, so we've made the case quite clearly that a lot of the financing is going to have to come from the private sector, right, to be able to enable this just transition. But the intent is the thing that is going to change that, right? It's not reporting for reporting's sake, but it's about how are you fundamentally rethinking your business and its impact, and of course those opportunities, and then translating that into investment into those things that are going to drive those changes that we need to see. And so it has to be very intentional. If we wait for it to be as a consequence of regulation, it's very reactive. And we need to be so much more proactive if we have any hope of achieving that 1.5 degree ambition, which already feels like it's out of reach. And we know that this is really that existential threat. So, I mean, it's difficult to overstress the need for boards to understand that stewardship role in where companies need to go, and the need to actually be intentional about it. So you have to go looking for that. You need to be guided by something. There are planetary boundaries, there's social context that we need to solve for, and understand that. And that is a bit of the missing link, I think, right now. If we take it from a risk perspective, often we are reactive and sometimes not even reactive enough. And so that clear intent of what is at stake and how we need to change that is, I think, for me, that factor that's going to make that change, to drive that investment behavior change. Regulation is coming, and we know that's happening fast in different parts of the world, but is it fast enough to precipitate the change that's needed to keep us within the boundary we need to keep?
Thanks, Shameela. Brigitte, there's a question that came through specifically for you, and the question is, should we not look at the poverty issues and decarbonization as a huge opportunity as well? I hope this is not oversimplification, but perhaps a different lens at which to look at into our unique situation. Of course, we would have to dig deep by bringing innovation and building capabilities, collaborating more and committing resources. Would you like to add anything on that?
Yes, thank you, Julie, and thanks for that question, Godfrey. I apologize if it came across that our lens on that is a very strong risk lens, which is obviously a relevant lens, but we always look at the opportunity side more proactively, even, I think, in terms of our strategic intent to create positive impacts. And I think there are huge opportunities in this space. And we reference some material SDGs in terms of understanding what those unmet client needs are and where those business opportunities are, also to address that, and at the same time create climate justice. So for Nedbank, it has been a very key focus. As a purpose-led organization, we try to find the sustainable finance opportunities that address client needs, and that really contributes to a just transition. So absolutely correct. A lot of the board focus is also on the opportunity side, and we were very cognizant of that when we looked at the mandate of the committee, where we actually in the naming have been specific to say this is about climate resilience. It's not only about managing climate risk, but it's also understanding the opportunities both for a business, which is imperative, but also for all of our stakeholders. And that informs the product development side. We do acknowledge, I think, that there needs to be an acceleration of sustainable financing, and that has been a key focus for the bank. With the issuance of bonds and raising of funding for that, but also in terms of what could be a retail offering, for example, for embedded generation in a residential market and the likes. But absolutely correct, this comes with both risk management and huge opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Brigitte. We've had a question up for a while now, and I'm not quite sure who can answer this one. Is South Africa's energy mix, for example, and that is nuclear, renewables, coal, balanced? Is it balanced and realistic? Given our fiscal position, who finances the low carbon transition? Anyone who feels they can answer that one? Okay, Nicole, do you want to give it a bash?
Sure. So I can respond, but I'm not sure that it will really answer it. So I must caveat by saying that I'm not an energy sector expert. So that's very important to understand. But because there's two parts to that question. So the first one is about, is the mix sort of balanced and appropriate? I would argue not. The research that we've seen shows that, just as an indication, the IRP, which is the Integrated Resource Plan for South Africa, is contradictory to the NDCs, right? So what the NDC, which Gordon mentioned earlier, so our strategy that we've submitted as part of the Paris Agreement for where we need to be and the time we need to be there, that outlines very specific steps around the energy sector and transformation that needs to happen in there. And the IRP, which is the plan we use domestically to identify investment opportunities in the energy sector, doesn't keep up, right? So if you were to just follow the IRP, you would not meet the targets in the NDC. So I think that's something to keep in mind. So again, I'm not an energy sector expert, but based on the research that exists and just comparing what we said we want to achieve with what the plan is we've got in place, there's an inconsistency there. So that's definitely a problem. When it comes to who finances this energy transition, I think just to reiterate what we've been saying is that it's got to be collaborative. It's got to be public and private sector working together. At COP26 last year, and someone had dropped it down in the chats as well, so as a reminder, there was also a commitment made by some other governments from around the world to help finance that transition, to work with Eskom, for example, in transitioning to a more sustainable and inclusive system. But there isn't a sort of one answer on who finances that. It really needs to be a collaborative effort. It's just too big. And I think, but to give you some comfort, because I know that this is always saying like, oh, it's so big and we'll never get there, but to give you some comfort, South Africa's independent power producer program for the renewable energies is actually held up globally as a really good example of how to get started on that. So we have the bones in place to do that and to get that financing sort of collaboration going. So I remain optimistic that we will solve that. It's a tricky one to crack, but we seem to be on track to get it right if we just keep pushing.
Thanks, Nicole. Anything else from the panelists? Okay, I'm going to just jump into the next question. And the question is from one of our audience members, a question about stakeholder engagement, that is the community lobby groups, climate activists, proxy institutions, and class action suits. This requires a new level of thought and action by boards and executives, also mindful of shareholder expectations that are often different to these stakeholders. Can the panel please share any high-level thoughts on engaging with these important stakeholders in the future to ensure alignment and also traction towards achieving climate goals? So that was quite a statement and a question in one. And I wanted to ask Shameela if it would be possible, if you would like to have a crack at that.
Sorry, unmute. So yes, Julie, so the issue of multiple stakeholder needs is a real one, and we're seeing that, right? But also in many instances, if you're looking at this, if you're looking at lobby groups and activists or whatever, again, it might be a little bit reactive as an approach. So I think ideally, to be able to deal with that, a company needs to have its own strategy in mind. It has to have done its own homework, right? In understanding what is required by science, therefore, how can I justify my strategy, and how am I building that out in terms of risk and opportunity, so that when you are faced with those different stakeholder groups, whatever, you have had some of the thinking. And of course, that doesn't exclude the fact that you would have needed to have engaged with those groups and hopefully have identified them as key stakeholders in the creation of that strategy and the identification of what is material for your company, how you need to do that, and hopefully have already gotten the input in the creation of the strategy. So yes, that's an ideal world, but hopefully, if, ideally, yes, you should have had a view of that. You should have been engaging with those stakeholders to be able to understand their different perspectives as well, bring that together to inform your strategy in what you're doing. And then in that way would have been able to have already, in some instance, thought about what those stakeholder needs are and brought them along your journey. So they're not kind of dealing with you in a slightly more antagonistic way when they're an activist at your AGM. And so that, that perspective is both your own kind of stewardship, but also what is ideal in driving that strategy and anticipating that and ensuring that you've adequately considered and brought on board the different stakeholders. The identification of those stakeholders, of course, is a different matter. And that really goes to how well you know who that community is. And there, when we're looking at from a sustainability lens, I think this issue of that outside in and inside out approach is important. And the concepts of double materiality, for example, are existent in our discourse in this country in terms of governance, and bringing that together and using that lens in that understanding of stakeholder needs, and then using that basis to be able to inform your strategy and how you approach it, and equally to be able to say what you can and can't do, and be in a position where you can defend that, right? So you own your strategy, you own what you're doing, and you've had that engagement, and you've been able to adequately consider those needs up front, rather than being reactive to them and then piecemeal trying to deal with things as they come up. I don't know if that helps, but I'm trying to think, how one better mitigates for that risk of this kind of divergent opinions at any point, and start with that end in mind.
Thanks, Shameela. Anybody else want to add anything on that point? Chris, please go ahead.
I could come in terms of the sort of science evidence assessment, again, that comes out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments. And I think there's two important points here. And one is the context for which this is happening in South Africa. And so there's something we talk about in the research community is climate change literacy. And so has someone heard of climate change? Do they think it's caused by people, or do they know it's caused by people? And do they understand the consequences? And social opinion surveys, such as those done by Afrobarometer that survey tens of thousands of people across Africa, South Africa comes in the lowest category for climate change literacy out of the 20 or so countries surveyed on the continent. It's less than 30% of South Africans report that they've heard of climate change and that they understand it's caused by human actions. So we're doing this in the context of a fairly low climate change literacy country, which is a big problem. One of the strongest predictors of climate change literacy is, have you finished high school or do you have a university degree? So improving education in South Africa is a huge co-benefit for climate change action. And so when we come to these stakeholder engagement type of arenas, I think one thing that the private sector and business can do a lot more is, like we're doing right now, have these types of learning and sharing sessions, but also sort of background evidence briefs, so that the many stakeholders who are coming to those tables are, to some extent, climate literate at the point that they don't immediately feel threatened by this informational action, but they can be more general collaboration around understanding at least a similar fundamental understanding of the risks. Of course, there can always be people who have different intentions, who don't care about the risks for whatever their value judgments are and want to go a different direction. But I think at least if we increase that base level of literacy, we're in a much stronger position as a country to respond to these risks. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Shameela, I want to just circle back again to the JSC's new guidance on disclosure. And I wanted to ask you, I know the guidance is not final yet, but have you, can you share a flavor of the inputs that you have received so far on this public commentary phase?
Thank you, Judy. So we did get, quite a wide array of feedback, I think, largely from our issuers supportive of what we were doing. And then, slightly different perspectives within organizations. Interestingly, in some organizations, like, I can give an example. One asset manager, for example, had different perspectives coming from different parts of the organization. So when they were answering as the listed company, they had one perspective, and then when they're answering as the asset manager, you're looking to use that information that you were hopefully driving issues to disclose, was actually a completely different perspective. And very interesting for us to see those kinds of dynamics coming through, as people were responding to the guidance. But like I said, by and large, supportive. To the question that was asked earlier about, the alignment with the IWSB, that was another set of comments that was coming through quite strongly. I don't think with anybody saying you have to align, but more kind of saying we need to consider that context when we bring it in more strongly. So very useful comments from there. Sadly, divergent opinions on things like, not divergent opinions, but sometimes I think differences in understanding and issues like double materiality, for example. So we've seen now from some of the comments coming through where there's the opportunity to help, inform that landscape, or bring closer together some of the thinking, or just make it clearer where differences do exist that are creating confusion for companies, and at least giving them where the different elements sit together, and so they can make their own decision about what they want to do in those instances. But so those are some of the things we're seeing. Not massive. There was no like opposition, for example, that was like, no, you should not do this. This is not a good idea. By and large, it was, this is helpful, but these are the things that, we would like to see. We did see a lot more input on the metrics. So we have both the narrative disclosure elements, and of course, we made sure we brought together things like the King guidance on climate disclosures, all of those sorts of stuff to make sure that those elements are covered in the guidance. But the metrics part, I think, is obviously something that's fairly new in that we've tried to put together the best of what we could see globally. We're not reinventing the wheel. So each metric, for example, we've given links directly back to an existing either GRI or a SASB or one of the others. So it's quite clear where they come from. Those things, I think, became issues where there was a little bit more debate. And, certain people, for example, didn't want a lot of transparency on issues like remuneration and director remuneration or CEO pay, those kinds of things, and others wanted more transparency on those issues. So those were the kinds of things that were coming through. You could see distinct interest group differences in views on these things. And so that's where we're sitting at. So for me, I think the encouraging thing first and foremost was that there was engagement on it and people were interested, that once they started looking at indicators, it started jogging thinking. And then from that also a lot of very useful input for us on, what is critical in a country like ours? What sort of metrics should we be looking at? Are these the right ones? A one that has a question mark on it right now, I think, is nature related. So in terms of the metrics is the biodiversity area that we're looking at. And it's an area that we're probably going to have to pay a lot more attention to going forward. But those are the kinds of areas. And if we look at now, just in the context of this conversation, just how important it is to understand nature-related disclosures and things like that, those are areas I think we'll build out possibly for the future, but very useful input from that regard. So Julie, I think, by and large, I think a lot of gratitude from especially our issuers saying this is helpful for us. It helps us set the context, appreciated the climate disclosure guidance and the contextualization that we brought, more of which we're going to do. And then, of course, a lot of different views on some of the metrics, but by and large, a lot of support in that regard.
Thanks, Shameela, and good luck with that process. I think quite a few people are heading into a load shedding stage now, and I saw someone ask if we will share a link to this webinar, which we will. It's always available on our website about a week after the event. Chris, I want to just go back. You answered a question from our audience member. You responded to him in a written response. But I thought just for the purposes of sharing with our other audience members, the question was, to what extent do you engage with the presidential commissions on climate change and planning to influence their activities? This person is asking, as it seems that if we are slow out of the blocks and the Minister of Minerals and Energy is pulling in other directions, so there is a lot of discussion, but relative little action to make real progress in line with our climate commitments. I know you have covered some of these things before in previous responses, but would you mind sharing just with the audience what you conveyed to him in that question, for that question?
So I'd say as climate researchers, we have been invited to the Presidential Climate Commission. I presented there on the latest findings from the best available science on climate change. Our role there is very much as informers to the decision makers, not influencers. There's sort of quite a clear role that we have defined for ourselves as being policy informative, not policy prescriptive. That changes, for example, if I'm like actually employed inside a ministry or something, I have a different remit, but at the Presidential Climate Change Commission, we're there to brief on the best available science. I will agree that the draft climate change bill that is currently out for comment until this Friday does seem to lack urgency, given that this is a critical decade for climate action. The bill talks about a lot of things coming into force that are already kind of happening, and then it gives another 4 or 5 years, depending on the sector, for those things to even have plans, by which time we're almost at 2030. And so I think a key criticism that I would have of the bill in its draft form currently is it lacks the urgency that the science points to so clearly. And I think that a lot of people in the private sector and in research and people living in places like Durban already know that this is a problem now. So that sense of urgency, not the criticism of the draft bill, but that sense of urgency has also been communicated to the Presidential Climate Commission. But at that point, it's over to them how they choose to make reports back to the executive and recommendations they might make.
Thanks, Chris. That actually leads us into, I think, might be our last question, and you've now partially covered that, is Charlie has asked, it's a comment and then a question. The recent floods in KZN, in his view, is a result of as a result of major recent developments around these areas, which have not been given adequate attention to stormwater drainage, etc. How do we create greater awareness in government that the decisions by government which fail to take cognizance of the impact of the decisions on the environment is often the cause of catastrophic disasters such as that of KZN? So I think the main part of that question is, how do we create greater awareness in government to address these issues? Anyone's got any suggestions on that? Jess, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, I think it's the nature of the systemic challenge, and Chris spoke to this as well, literacy. The literacy rates is not just among the general public. The survey that we did with IWSB is most directors of companies wouldn't feel comfortable to explain climate change to a colleague or understand the difference in some of those key scenarios. So literacy is really something we need to collectively build. And you know, we work with a lot of amazing government colleagues who have different mandates. So some people's mandate is local economic development. Some people's mandate is housing. The challenge is when we don't talk to each other, understand systemic risks. I'm really struggling here, Julie. I'm so sorry.
No problem. You were right getting into the meat of that answer there, and then your load shedding impacts are coming, affecting
grinding me to a halt. So maybe the short version of that is we need to build our collective understanding, and we need to have better and more inclusive conversations, and we need to have them really urgently.
But you raised some good points there about different mandates. Okay, so I think we have covered all our questions. Yes, go.
Could I come in, I think, with an important point on that question, and that's something that I think when we think about risk, a lot of us don't often consider, is there are two parts of this. It's like there's the climate hazard, which in the case of the Durban floods is the heavy rainfall, and then there's what type of society does that land on or hit, right? And people like to say, oh, we blame it on climate change, or we blame it on local government. The impacts are because the climate changed, or the impacts are because the local government was unprepared. And almost always the answer is both, right? So if we look at the Cape Town drought, if we look at the Durban floods, you had human-caused climate change increased the intensity or the likelihood of those hazards, and local governments were unprepared. And so I think it's really important for people to keep both of those in mind, because it speaks to the need to do both, which is reduce our greenhouse gases to prevent the hazards, and then also to adapt locally to limit the risks. Like, we can't just say, okay, we're doing one or the other. We really need to do both. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I think we've covered, and you've definitely answered a lot of the questions I had prepared for you. I don't know if I'm just going to invite our panelists to just close up the session with maybe a thought or two from themselves on the subject, and something that we should take away with us. And do you mind, Nicole, if I start with you first? Sorry, just dumping you in there.
No, that's all right. So I guess thank you to everyone for being so engaged in this discussion. I mean, the questions have been great. It's been such a wide range of topics that we've covered. And I think that speaks to, the quality of the IWSA members who are here today. So thank you for taking this first step to educate yourself, and to hopefully you'll take that back to your boards and build that sort of collective knowledge around these things. I think something that stands out for me really is that the conversation, and I think a lot of the people on the panel will agree with me, over the last few years has really shifted. If we had had this discussion 3 or 4, even maybe 2 years ago, it really would have been focused on what is, climate change, sustainability, ESG, why should I even care, right? That would have been the focus. And it's so great to see that the focus of the conversation today has been around, how do we do this? How do we address this? We know what's happening. We know we need to do something. And now we're talking about, what is it? What are those steps that we need to take? And we're very fortunate in the sense that there are a lot of great frameworks and tools and organizations and resources available to help you take that step to get started. So I think my sort of closing thought is really just a reiteration of the fact that we don't have time to wait. Please be proactive. Please make use of the resources that are available. Things like the IWSA. I mean, the embedding project videos that Jess shared are great. This little guidance booklet is really helpful to get the conversation started within your organization. I'm sure everyone on this panel is happy to be contacted if you have other questions around how to get started in your organization. But yeah, just the closing from me is, don't wait. Get started. When you get back to your desk tomorrow morning, there's very specific things that you can start with. There's questions you can ask. So please do that. Don't just switch the webinar off and then forget about this.
Thanks, Nicole. Shameela, do you have any final thoughts?
Will completely concur with Nicole on those thoughts. And, the imperative to change is massive. And it requires leadership, but each of us can lead in our own way, in different areas, different divisions. You don't need to be the sustainability manager or the ESG team to do that. The change is required from every single area of people applying their minds to how, it applies in their different areas. So we need leaders from all sectors, from all areas, to be able to apply their minds to do this. And it is that collective will that is going to get us to where we need to get to, and nothing else really. There's a saying I heard a while back that said that if you don't invest in the future we want, then the one that we get is going to be worth infinitely less. And I think that's very important, because we're all investors and we're all invested in making this happen. And so that's it. And Julie, sorry, I just realized there was a last question there from Nanda in the chat. If you don't mind, I think maybe I'll try and answer it. And his question was around major trends in consumer and customer patterns, behavior change, purchasing power in response to climate change impacts. So my sense on this is that it's a lot to do with basically 3 things: accessibility, affordability, and education. So if you're looking at how you're going to change what you consume, a lot of that, is going to differ in different communities, different societies. And unfortunately, sometimes a lot of the solutions we're seeing now are actually a little bit more expensive than what we get. And if we're in a context now where, we're sitting with low economic growth and people's salaries are not keeping up with their basic needs, and that choice becomes limited, right? It becomes more driven by a price point than an environmental need. But as the education changes, hopefully that changes, but also as we apply our minds more and we invest more in this, we'll bring down those prices so that those things become more accessible. And then it's not that question. I mean, right now, if we're sitting in a context of load shedding, are you thinking about putting solar panels on your roof, or did you go out and buy the generator that's diesel powered? And those are the kinds of choices that we're faced with at the moment. So in terms of consumer patterns and behavior, I think it's different in different contexts and economic realities at this point in time. And so the imperative to actually bring better choices to people at an affordable level is there. So it's a huge business opportunity too. And so I want to say that. And then from another perspective of choice, and it's not necessarily consumer in terms of product consumption, but there is a generational shift in thinking that I think is really something we need to pay attention to as well. So those people that are going to be our employees of the future, and a lot has been said about the millennial effect, but beyond that as well, they're going to be both the people that are going to be our population our employee base in our companies, and are looking for a different type of behavior, and for actually people who are being more responsible towards environment and social issues. And so they're going to use that as a basis to start picking and choosing. So it's going to become a skills issue and a competition for how we actually position and we're able to access that. But remember, they're also investors of the future. And they're the people who are going to be investing in your company as well, and so understanding that those kinds of preferences are starting to change from a consciousness change is also important. So I'm hoping that goes a little bit of way to see that. And there has been evidence of that, where that shift is happening intergenerationally in what they're prioritizing and thinking about. So that says a lot to our consumer bases of the future as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Shameela. Brigitte, is there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Thanks, Julie. I think a really great engagement, and maybe just want to encourage directors. I think that there is absolute urgent need for proactivity and really bold leadership around this. And, there is no perfect solution, and there is so much value that board members can bring from a neural diversity perspective that it would be so fantastic to see directors across all of our corporates really lean into this challenge, increase your own climate literacy, but work in collaboration with others, because it is quite a daunting journey. And I must say, just working with the Nedbank board and thinking through scenarios and the challenges collectively is a learning space also for your executives and the people that are tasked to implement a lot of the strategy imperative. So really, I think maybe just an ask for that bold leadership. Climate literacy is an issue across all of the value chain, from our clients to ourselves and as board members. So just, a huge thank you for taking the time to learn more about this, and just open to also sharing experiences offline if that is helpful at any stage. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think, again, thank you to everyone for attending and for asking such really good questions. And thank you to the co-panelists for their insights. I won't repeat things. I'll try and cover some slightly different ground. And I think that's from the science assessment basis, which is looking at thousands of academic papers over the last decade. There are really 8 things that stand out for enhancing climate action in a South African and African context. And I'll run through them quickly. I won't go into all the details. But the first one is there's a huge need for increased funding of knowledge and leadership of research in Africa. And that's in the private sector and in universities. Only about 4% of global climate change research spending focuses on Africa. And we know that we have an outsized problem on this continent. So increased funding for knowledge and research leadership, research and development. Second one is climate services. Things like our telecoms industries have a huge role to play here in improving data access, getting data to the people who need it, early warning services, weather algorithms. There's a lot of opportunity for research, private sector collaboration on regular weather station data reporting. The number of reporting weather station stations in South Africa in the last decade has actually gone way down at a time when the climate crisis is going up. We're monitoring it less. The third one, we talked a lot about improving climate literacy. There's a huge co-benefit for education for climate action. The fourth one is climate finance, where there's a lot of private sector money starting to go into greenhouse gas reduction projects through clean energy. There needs to be an increase in investment in adaptation. So that's helping us adapt to the risks, not just the focus on the energy sector, and the private sector could play a huge role there. The fifth one is governance, and it's this point about collaboration. It really will take an inclusive all of government approach with public sector and private sector in a way to avoid elite capture of climate projects. That's something that the research identifies as a risk, right? As a country, we experience state capture. It's not inconceivable that some very large climate projects could also become subject to elite capture, and we should avoid that and make sure that they benefit all South Africans. Legislation, South Africa is moving on this, it's good. Increased urgency around climate legislation that helps set direction. It helps bring in funding because you now have clear directions at legislation level in the country around the intentions you intend to make on climate action. The seventh one is ecosystem-based approaches, as Jess mentioned, working in alliance with nature, especially in our cities, to reduce climate risks, having more green space, having more eco-friendly buildings, having more spaces that absorb flood waters within our cities instead of large parking lots that help water just rush off much faster and create a flood risk. And then the final one is working across sectors. So water, energy, and food, and biodiversity, and health, all collaborating together to solve a problem. Otherwise, the science indicates we're in a potentially dangerous place where someone tries to go really fast in the energy sector, but they end up having a negative impact on health, or they try and act really fast in food, but that's bad for water. So we really need to be having more of these types of discussions across sectors. And I'll end there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris. And Jess, last but not least, anything from yourself?
I mean, I guess I'm just reflecting that I hope the message has really come home. This is not an environmental issue. This is deeply a social issue, and it will have significant financial impacts, which will only reverberate back into the social challenges that are already unfolding. You know, sometimes in some of the classes, whether it's an MBA program or something, every now and then someone will say, well, you know, that doesn't affect us. We're worried about jobs. We're worried about kind of social unrest. And I hope the message is really clear that this is all inextricably linked. So this is deeply a social issue, deeply a financial issue. And it's the time for action was probably a while ago. The next best time for action is right now. If you're not sure on that next step to take, there's a lot of amazing people here who are really invested and knowledgeable, and like Brigitte said, happy to have the conversation. And I think the first step is just ask different questions. We've given guidance on that. It's in the report as well. So we really encourage you to, I think the last piece I'll just kind of finish on is the quote that comes to mind is, bad things happen when good people do nothing. And if we're expecting somebody else who's going to figure this out, I think we're already seeing we're in collective trouble. So I wish it was maybe a more optimistic note. It's a sombering one, and that's sometimes what we have to just be honest about as well. But there's huge opportunity. There's huge cause for optimism. If we can apply our amazing ingenuity, creativity, and ability to collaborate, the story could be changed. But that's up to us collectively. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Jess. As I mentioned before, we've had a lot of great information shared within the chat from our panelists and other members. I'm going to speak to our events team and see if we can pull all together, all those bits of information together and send it out into an email. I also think that it's important that I think we should. The report that Jess is referring to is an IWSB Trialogue and Sustainability Institute report, Climate Change Risks and Responses, a guide for business leaders. And I think what that can be found on our website library. The link will be circulated out, but I think it has been a discussion around in the IOD team that maybe we start a separate library for climate change with all this valuable information, so it's easy to find on our website. And I think I'll see if we can address that this week with our team. So I would just like to thank our team, our panelists. It's been a fantastic conversation. So much depth of knowledge and so much information. You can tell that you guys, well, our panelists, not guys, our panelists know the subject so well and can share so much valuable information. I will then try, as I've mentioned, give some of this information within links and guidance in our post event and onto our IWSB website into maybe its own dedicated library. A lot of the information is already there. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for weathering the load shedding, weathering the cold weather, and staying with us right to the end. And thank you again to our panelists. It's been an absolute treat having such informed people and having this discussion. I will say goodbye and have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.